Well, first of all, a little background. From 1935 to sometime in the 80s, both the natural gas and electric systems in the United States were essentially what they called cradle to grave regulation. In gas, they regulated wellhead prices, they regulated transmission. The states then took over regulated distribution and retail prices. Same thing was true in electric power. They regulated the wholesale sales, they regulated transmission, states took over and did retail regulation. In the 1980s, we started to re-examine the issue of whether or not that was the best model. And what had happened over time is that you could make a very strong argument that the commodity markets could be made competitive or even possibly were competitive, but were basically tied up in a bunch of inertia with long-term contracts and things like that. But as the century ended, we were very successful in unbundling the commodity from transmission, deregulating the commodity to a certain extent, making the transmission system open access, and essentially creating competition in both the natural gas and the electric power systems. The one nut that we haven't cracked yet is retail pricing, and you heard both Martin and Mark talk about that. And it's if you look at it, it's like going over a wall once you go from the transmission system to the distribution system. In the US, the transmission and the wholesale sales, or the sales at the wellhead, are very competitive and open access, and the distribution system is still using the techniques it had a century ago to price electricity. The gas and electricity markets were essentially untouched due to technological innovation, because they continued to make the processes more efficient and the prices continued to come down. So there wasn't a lot of people screaming and yelling. But eventually, due to some over-optimistic of demand forecasts, and electricity, the standard way to forecast demand was to attach it to somebody's forecast of the GDP. And the forecasts went wrong, and they ended up with a lot of extra capacity, and the utilities were actually amenable, or more amenable than they were before, to open access. We re-examined it. The philosophy for both gas and electric was to focus on the places where there were market power, and to get rid of the regulation to a certain extent where there wasn't market power. For example, the secondary markets for transmission, the sale of the commodity under certain rules, were all things that we could probably better regulate through competition. Now, there was a legal argument that said that prices had to be just and reasonable. The debate on what a just and reasonable price is goes back to the Greek philosophers, through the Roman Church, up through still at state commissions today. As a matter of fact, in the Roman Church, there was an interesting debate between whether or not markets could set just and reasonable prices, or whether or not you needed what we call cost of service here to set just and reasonable prices. Well, apparently in the US, they had forgotten about the market setting just and reasonable prices, and focused on the fact that you had to use cost of service. And when we pointed that out to the courts bought into it, that in fact you could let competition set just and reasonable prices. Well, the first set of essentially deregulation went in natural gas. It went fairly well. It's still working fairly well. And then in 1996, we required the electric transmission system to open access. And some of the power pools that existed existence at the time thought that was a step backwards. And so to accommodate them, we created what we call the independent system operator bias, or not the bias, the option. And they were quite happy with that. Now, to get yourself into the debate, you need essentially three languages and probably a fourth, where P in economics usually means price. In power systems, it's standard for reactive real power. Q is quantity in economics, and it's reactive power in electricity, and so on. And they use different phrases for essentially the same thing. Now, the design criteria for ISOs sort of followed a standard mix of economic properties and also some additional properties. And the one Frank Wallach asked me to mail this thing to him last night, I think. And I sent him the presentation. He said, make sure you make them understand that you have to have physically feasible dispatch. And so that's one of the design criteria that we used in these markets, and that the markets had to match up with the physics of the system. Now, the other thing is these markets are non-convex. And so when you invoke convexity and try to force fit these models into convexity, you lose market efficiency. As Martin pointed out, one of the interesting things is that if you basically try to make these markets convex, you lose all these complementarities. Complementarities don't exist in convex markets, and complementarities can be very important. The problem with complementarities, Martin's examples, is you can't get by with a single price. You have to have multiple prices, and it's efficient price discrimination. Let's move on. This is the iconic view of the feasible set of the AC power flow conditions. This is a graph from Ian Hiskins. It appears in most all presentations of this sort. And it's only 3 dimensions, and you can see that projection into 3 dimensions is awfully nasty and probably isn't even close to convex. And then when you think about this, we go from 3 dimensions to PJM, the system that's keeping the lights on in here today, where it has 15,000 nodes, 3,000 generators, 20,000 transmission lines, and a lot of variables and constraints when you go to the optimization. So it's a big problem. And nobody really pretends that we get it all correct. Now, the other problem here is the fact that the fossil fuel side of the business, and possibly some of the consumption side of the business, has startup costs, min and max production levels, minimum run times, yada, yada, yada. And so when you draw the simple 2-dimensional diagram, which uses supply and demand step functions, my feeling is what you really have to look at is the fact that each generator has declining average cost, and that the market clears up at the top at C3 and CAI3. It clears on the average cost curve, not on the marginal cost curve. And that's where these side payments come in, which are not very transparent. Now, as we move to a more renewable system, which probably won't be fully renewable in my lifetime, we sort of get rid of this part of the business, but we probably don't get rid of it on the demand side. In 1997, PJM was the first ISO to dip its foot into the market. It used Lagrangian relaxation, which is, we've talked about that before, as its clearing algorithm. Didn't do very well. But we started to come up on the learning curve. The learning curve, for example, We started out assuming convexities. That didn't work very well. It went to two-part pricing with make-whole payments. That settled the market down quite a bit. Didn't really solve the problem, in my opinion. We had a big debate about whether or not there would be congestion or not in the market. The no congestion folks won, and so we went to zonal markets. In PJM, in less than a year, they had figured out how to game that market. It collapsed, and they went to two-part. It's not the two-part. They went to nodal pricing. The reason why, in my contention, is that they looked at historical data, and the way the utilities ran their systems historically was very loosely. They didn't congest the system. They kept it uncongested. Yet when you put it into the market, you push it right up against the congestion, and you get congestion. There was no demand side. If you looked at the early models, they all have cost minimization with a single point for the demand. When you have a single point in this optimization model for demand, the implication is that demand is willing to pay an infinite amount of money to satisfy itself. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you dispatch a lot of very expensive generators just to get that all of the demand satisfied. Even today, less than 3% of the demand in the market is in the market. That's pathetic. And instead of having the demand side in the market to classically set what we would call scarcity prices, we put price caps on the market, very arbitrary, and they disappear as soon as the politics moves against them. In February of 2021 in ERCOT, they had an elaborate way of calculating the cost of reserves to keep the system going. They made that a part of the pricing mechanism. It was $9,000, I believe. That created a huge problem. And the Texas Railroad Commission changed the value of demand to, I think, $6,000 a megawatt hour overnight, without even making a calculation. So it would be nice to have a demand side in this market so that the demand side could set the scarcity price. And we wouldn't have a bunch of arguments about how you calculate it. Today, we have a bunch of markets that the ISOs operate. One of them is the day-ahead market. It's a financial hedge against the real-time market. It's a dispatch, a physical dispatch. We run it for about 36 to 48 hours for end of horizon effects. We only price 24 hours, the first 24. It's a multi-product with energy and reserves. It's also spatial and temporal with both time and space differentiated prices. And as I said before, it's a hedge into the real-time market. The real-time market runs every 5 minutes. It's a physical balancing market. It prices only the next period. It has limited commitment options and decommitment options because it does not have a long time horizon. But almost every fossil generator has a minimum runtime. And demand still in that market is forecasted as a vertical demand curve. We also have a transmission rights market, which I won't go into. It has a problem with revenue adequacy. We have a capacity market, which has a very weak pedigree because it was created because the energy market prices were too low. Now, it's very hard to sell a methodology that makes the price higher. But in fact, what we end up with is capacity markets, which now have gotten to be about 20% of the total energy market price. Here's another iconic picture. I've added the Western imbalance market, which basically is going to essentially extend the Cal ISO, and has to a certain extent over a fairly wide section of the Western market. The Western people don't particularly like being regulated by people in Washington, D.C., and so they're pretending that they're not being regulated right now. ISOs now account for over 70% of the U.S. market. Every day, about over $100 million changes hands, at least on paper. And with increased reliability, it would probably be saving at least $10 billion a year in its operation. As Martin mentioned, and right now this is one of the problems I'm working on, is there are computational issues. I mean, the market design is limited by computations. I mean, these are very big markets, very big optimization problems, and we're nowhere near actually solving the real physics problem, but we try. I mean, the objective is to get close. And as I said before, we originally used Lagrangian relaxation to solve this problem, but people hadn't noticed the fact that mixed integer program had taken some great leaps in the late 90s and early 2000s, and still is. And we had a conference in '99 showing how mixed integer programming should replace Lagrangian relaxation. 5 years later, PJM actually implemented it, saved about $500 million a year, which then gave us the hammer to beat on the rest of the ISOs to use mixed integer programming. And in 2017, all of the ISOs had developed that. And then another RP, a shameless plug, model, computational model, got 5 to 35 times speed ups on difficult problems. The model actually today still solves into a gap, which is about $24,000. So we are not really sure. I mean, the gap, basically, we may have the optimal solution, but we don't know it. And consequently, the gap says that we could be losing about $24,000 by by not having the optimal solution. Whoops, it's the wrong way. So after 20 years of these ISOs, is sort of like what Al was saying this morning, we probably need some maintenance or repainting or a couple, maybe even an extension onto the market. We're only about halfway there, and the market is changing under our feet. We're getting more renewables. We have lots of devices. I mean, in '78, Fred Schweppe sort of laid out how to do all this stuff. Now we have all the technology. It's there. It's almost ready to be used, and we have interval meters and all that. So we have all the hardware, if you will, for making the market more efficient, but we haven't been able to move the market design into a position where it will become more efficient. The market has always been stochastic, except that the engineers figured a way to sort of disappear the stochasticity in the market and pretend it was deterministic. But it has, there's always been a probability that the generator will fail. And they modify capacity to essentially represent that. And so there's a lot of subtle ways of dealing with stochastics. But the wind and solar stochastics are completely different than the failures mode of the other generators. And so weather forecasting is going to become really important, not only just for day-to-day operations, but for extreme weather. Arguably, in ERCOT in 2021, if they had a better forward look at the market, they would have been able to do a little bit better in terms of. I don't think they could have solved the problem, but they could have probably done a little bit better than the catastrophe. We expect to see greater price volatility. By the way, I would argue that the bidding process. The bidding process in the day-ahead market for wind and solar is not just to bid zero price. It's to bid a probabilistic supply curve, which includes the fact that if you don't realize the later steps on your supply curve, you're going to have to buy back your position in the real-time market, which could be very expensive. So that the supply curve is not going to look like a flat zero across. It's going to have an upward slope. Let's see, skipping over some things. Probably the most important thing is to get demand into the market. I mean, to just know, and by getting into the market, I don't mean time of use prices or all kinds of gimmicks that happen at the state level and been happening for the last 100 years. Get into the market and bid. I've been trying to talk to data centers and tell them, you know, why don't you bid your flexible load into the market? They all have excuses. I don't know why, including Google and Microsoft, and who are all represented here today. So, you know, take the message. And let's see. Well, since I don't have well, yeah, as I said before, the prices in the energy market are too low. And interestingly enough, although the value is represented as infinite, the demand, when it's a fixed point, can never set the price. And so with what you really want is for the demand side to be in the market and set the market price occasionally, including the reserve price and a whole bunch of other things. And also, you want to reflect the fact that when you're having extreme weather events, the prices are important to get people off the system and to get generators on the system, and not the Amber Alert that they used in California the last time they had a problem. I guess people from Stanford here, I don't know whether you got the Amber Alert or not, but it actually worked. I mean, it's a sort of an eleemosynary thing because you don't get any financial rewards other than not having to pay the price, which is a price that's been set a couple of years ago, probably. So it doesn't have anything to do with the current circumstances. We're working on the computational problems, as I said before, and in essence, there's lots of room for improving the system, especially in modern and extreme weather scenarios. We don't really know how to deal with them yet, but certainly we can do better. There's no doubt about that. And I think there's lots of room for improvement and billions of dollars at stake. Thank you.